So that girl I met on eHarmony.
Yeah.
We're out to dinner last night, and like a klutz, I tipped my drink all over myself.
Oh, no.
And it's all down my shirt, a horrible stain, so embarrassing. And you'll never guess.
What?
She smiles, picks up her drink, spills it all over her top. So now we're...
No way.
Amazing, right?
At eHarmony, you'll find someone you can be yourself with. Get who gets you on eHarmony. Sign up for eHarmony today.
Body fat is bad. It's a visible metric of poor health, and it should be your primary aim to reduce it to zero. Lies. Not all body fat is created equal, and it's helpful for your long-term health to know the differences. So let's get into it. You're listening to the Health Courage Collective podcast, episode 141, Good Body Fat. Welcome to the Health Courage Collective podcast, the show for women who are too busy to slog through hours of generalized, inapplicable, and often contradictory health information, but too smart to ignore that a few minutes of focused attention now can prevent years of suffering in the future. I'm your host, Christina Hackett, a pharmacist who doesn't want you to live on prescriptions, a certified coach specifically trained to maximize your potential, and a compulsive learner obsessed with preventative, cutting-edge, holistic, and integrative medicine. I'm on a mission to increase your physical and mental resilience so you can fearlessly look forward to your next 40-plus limitless years. Your time is now. Let's go. Hello, and thank you for being here today. Welcome to the podcast. How are your resources? Have you thought about how different your life and future will be when you're well-resourced? It makes a big difference, and you have so much control over how well-resourced you are when you show up to do whatever matters to you. Today, we're going to talk about good body fat. Is there such a thing? Body fat is very much vilified as the great evil that we all need to rid ourselves of. But there's more to it than that, and I think that understanding and loving your body fat more will help you to put more years lived in good health into your future. Have you heard Jim Gaffigan's joke about everybody's always talking about good fats and bad fats? I like to think that I'm a good fat. First, let's talk about why we even have body fat in the first place. I think it's super interesting. Most people know that fat is kind of a storage depot for excess energy. If you eat more calories than you burn, then you can save some for later. It's brilliant, really. There's much more to it than that, but that's what I think most people think of. And it's true, it is an insurance policy against starving to death. Fat also insulates us so we don't get too cold. It's a layer of protection that's a bit of an insurance policy against freezing to death. The insulation is also a bit of a cushion that protects our organs and body structures from getting bumped and knocked around too much. Even so, even a relatively ripped human has a lot more body fat than a run-of-the-mill chimpanzee, who we're genetically closely related to. There's a link in the show notes to an interesting article from Science Daily that explains how one of the few changes between the DNA of chimpanzees and humans is that humans now have a decreased ability to turn calorie-storing fat into calorie-burning fat. Chimpanzees are still able to turn white fat into brown fat to stay lean and metabolically healthy, but those genes have been locked up in humans. Early humans needed to be able to plump up and keep more of their fat as a white fat calorie storage depot because otherwise there was no way they could have been able to meet the energy demands of an abnormally large brain. In the 6 million years since humans and chimpanzees became separate species, human brains have tripled in size, and chimpanzee brains haven't changed at all. The human brain uses more energy pound for pound than any other tissue, including muscle. While we'd love to have more calorie-burning brown fat now that we have both Cinnabon and Instagram, without the ability to store up more energy on our bodies, we would never have been able to develop such large brains. Interesting, right? So body fat's an inert repository for excess energy so that we can fuel our huge brains, right? Nope. Well, kind of. We have different kinds of body fat with different roles to play. I hesitated to label them bad and good because they have different functions, but then I realized that some of them really are really bad. So you'd be extremely wise to invest your resources in preventing or eliminating those. So even though this episode is named Good Body Fat, we're going to start off talking about the bad body fat and progress toward the good. I do think it's so valuable to understand that there are differences and not all fat is bad or metabolically unhealthy, even if you find it cosmetically undesirable. Your body is smart and it knows what it's doing, and it's good at prioritizing keeping you alive. And you really can't tell how metabolically fit someone is by looking at them. So let's stop the insanity, shall we? There are two kinds of fat that you absolutely do not want. Well, kind of three. One of them is visceral fat. You've probably heard of visceral fat before. It's not just about not having that beer gut look. Your viscera are your internal organs, so visceral fat is fat that's packed right around those and sometimes inside of them in the case of your liver. Knowing that fat serves as a bit of a cushioning, visceral fat doesn't seem that bad, and you often can't see it at all, so that seems like a positive. But visceral fat excretes tons of inflammatory signaling molecules, which has massive negative effects on your immune system and your body as a whole. Inflammation is most likely a root cause component of premature aging, chronic pain, autoimmune conditions, metabolic dysfunction, cardiovascular disease, cancer, mental health problems, and a bunch of other things like skin conditions and hormone problems. The lower your chronic inflammation, the healthier you are overall. And it's impossible to have low inflammation if you have visceral fat. There are certain kinds of visceral fat like intrahepatic fat, which is in your liver. We talked about that in episode 115 about loving your liver. Fat there leads to cholesterol type problems, cardiovascular problems, detoxing problems, and even cirrhosis or liver cancer. Parapancreatic fat around your pancreas can damage your beta cells, which impairs your ability to properly make insulin. Visceral fat is a big deal because it's not just a storage container for extra calories that you're saving for later. It's not an insurance policy against starvation or cold temperatures. It's not inert at all. It's a metabolically active destroyer of health, and it needs to be taken seriously. It speeds up senescence, which is the creation of those zombie cells we talked about in episode 55, Zombies Inside You. When your cells turn undead, you start aging much more quickly. The second kind of fat you definitely want to avoid as much as possible is intramuscular fat. Your meat market value to others does not go way up if your muscles are like Wagyu beef. Who knew? A normal consequence of aging, like declining bone density and eyesight, is that fat starts to accumulate in the muscle. There's intermuscular fat and intramuscular fat. I find it highly fascinating, but it doesn't really matter for our purposes today. Suffice it to say that fat in your muscles is also not an inert storage depot. Intramuscular fat droplets signal molecules that suppress muscle growth, weaken immunity, and drive inflammation. Age-related muscle loss is a big deal and a huge cause of liveliness being removed from your life. The more intramuscular fat you have, the more muscle renewal is suppressed. Even if you're super intelligent and know that improving your muscle mass is probably the biggest lever you can pull to create an amazing life in your 70s, 80s, and 90s, your efforts will be blunted, if not out and out negated, if there's fat in your muscle cells. Your fantastic work will all be for nothing. In addition to killing your biggest chance for setting yourself up for a strong and metabolically healthy future, intramuscular fat weakens your immunity and drives up your inflammation. It also reduces your ability to be sensitive to insulin, because muscles have a lot to do with that. This is a huge deal. Healthy muscle sucks up glucose and keeps you sensitive to insulin. Muscle mixed with fat drives up metabolic dysfunction and increases your chances of getting type 2 diabetes and all the inflammatory and pro-aging consequences that come along with that. Keeping fat out of your muscles as much as possible and for as long as possible will keep you younger longer, period. Next up is subcutaneous fat, the fat just under your skin. While this is most of the fat you can see on your body, and you might have opinions about it and how it looks, for the most part, it is more or less benign, kind of. Remember, we needed to develop this way to store extra energy for later so that we could be sure to keep operating our brains, even if we run out of food for a few days or weeks. So that's good. Some people have a greater capacity for subcutaneous fat storage. This doesn't sound great, having the ability to pack on more subcutaneous white fat. As far as I know, this capacity is just genetic. In his book Outlive, Dr. Peter Attia, one of my favorite people, compares it to a bathtub. Some people are born with larger bathtubs than others. Metabolic problems don't come from what is in your subcutaneous bathtub. They come from what spills out of your subcutaneous bathtub. Once you exceed your subcutaneous storage center's capacity to store excess energy for later, fat starts going into your muscles and around your organs. That is devastating to your health. It's the spillover from your capacity that's catastrophic. Someone with a large bathtub, so to speak, might have quite a bit of subcutaneous fat that you can see. But as long as they're not overflowing, it's possible for them to be quite metabolically healthy. There can be some other orthopedic type problems from being heavy, but at a metabolic level, you can't tell from someone's back fat whether they're metabolically healthy or not. Likewise, someone can look pretty and petite in their miniskirt and have a health-destroying amount of visceral fat and intramuscular fat. They're skinny fat, so to speak, or have a small capacity to store subcutaneous fat before it overflows to the organs and muscles. The tricky part is that while subcutaneous fat is much more inert than visceral or intramuscular fat, it's still not just a mobile storage system. Body fat is a whole system of fat cells, immune cells, stem cells, and extracellular collagen matrix cells. The configuration of these things can still be somewhat pro-inflammatory or non-inflammatory. Much more important than the quantity of your fat is the health of your fat. Joel Green, who wrote a book called The Immunity Code, teaches that body fat is an unacknowledged component of the immune system and the aging process. I learned a ton about the extracellular matrix, which I didn't even know about before from his book. We'll have to save that for later. It's pretty fascinating, especially from the perspective of why almost everyone who manages to lose fat regains it and how to not. But it's too long of a discussion for today, sadly. Something else that's really interesting that Joel Green explains is that one of the reasons we have body fat that we didn't even mention yet is that it's a good storage depot for extra toxins. Healthy fat protects you from the cellular damage that can come from environmental toxins and damaged proteins and other cellular debris. Your main detoxifiers for environmental toxins are your liver and kidneys and sweat glands. You have other housekeeping processes for damaged cellular debris. If they have too much to handle, the spillover goes to body fat, where it can be sequestered away from your vital body systems until the detox systems are able to come back online and detox them later. Genius. Seriously, your fat is pretty freaking awesome. The problem is that not all subcutaneous fat stays healthy like that. Joel Green calls them young fat and old fat. Both are subcutaneous fat, but young fat has those extra protective abilities, and old fat has lost that backup fail-safe superpower. Young fat has stem cells that can turn into new young fat. Old fat's stem cells tend to turn into inflammatory immune cells that wreak havoc around your body. Joel Green says that old fat is particularly prone to cause cancer. I haven't researched that claim well, but it doesn't sound good. So our order here is visceral fat, intramuscular fat, old subcutaneous fat, and then young subcutaneous fat. The interesting thing is that if you have a large metaphorical bathtub, you could have maybe 40 pounds of fat on your body, but if 38 of that is subcutaneous fat and just 2 pounds of that is visceral fat, that's devastating. The safe amount of visceral fat is exceedingly small, like close to zero. That's important to remember. A little bit of visceral fat is not benign. Lastly, let's go out of order and talk about the best fat. You've probably heard of brown fat before. Brown fat is awesome, and it's metabolically active in a good way. Babies have a lot of brown fat, which helps them to not freeze to death, but we lose most of it the older we get. Adults do have some brown fat around their neck, kidneys, adrenal glands, aorta, and mediastinum in the center of their chest. You want as much brown fat as you can possibly get. Interestingly, brown fat cells are born from the same kind of stem cells that make muscle cells, not fat cells. Brown fat breaks down blood sugar and fat molecules to create heat, and it maintains a safe body temperature. The more brown fat you have, the higher your resting metabolic rate, so you naturally burn more calories at rest. The best way to activate your little bit of remaining brown fat is to get cold. Brown fat is energy hungry and a great energy burner, kind of like muscle. Like muscle, you want as much of it as you can get. Unlike muscle, we don't have a systematic and reliable way to gain more brown fat. We have so little of it that increasing it by any significant amount is quite difficult. This brings us to our almost as good as brown fat body fat, beige fat. Have you heard of it? As you might infer from the name, beige fat is a little bit white fat, which remember is subcutaneous fat, and a little bit brown fat. Beige fat cells shapeshift a little bit. They can store energy like white fat, but under certain conditions, they can burn energy to create heat. Beige fat deposits are pea-sized and intermingled among white fat. Adults have beige fat deposits in the white fat around the brain, under the skin in the face, in the abdomen, glutes, thighs, near the collarbone, and along the spine. What makes brown fat brown instead of white and beige fat a little bit brown, you may ask? It's my favorite little guy's mitochondria, in this case mitochondria that contain iron. Brown fat expresses high levels of a certain protein required by mitochondria to burn calories and generate heat. Beige fat contains low levels of those proteins, but it can upregulate its production if it needs to. So, how might one go about making their light beige cells darker beige? That's not really a thing, but activated beige fat stimulates healthy energy burning, which could lead to healthy weight loss. Yes, there is such a thing as unhealthy weight loss. Activated beige fat improves insulin sensitivity, which is huge, and it increases leptin levels, which helps you feel less hungry. The two ways we know of to activate beige fat are cold exposure and stimulation of a hormone called irisin, which you can stimulate via exercise. There are some studies saying that applying heat to areas thought to contain beige fat can activate the beige fat, but it just says locally applied heat. I think it was near infrared heat. So I'm not sure why getting hot would make you activate a system that makes you stay warmer, or whether full body heat like in a sauna would help anything, but maybe. Sounds kind of counterintuitive, but I think it works. Mostly we're sure that exercise and cold exposure work to stimulate beige fat. So there you have it. You have a lot of good body fat. As long as your subcutaneous fat is still able to be a detox assistance program and isn't harboring lots of pro-inflammatory immune cells, probably more of your body fat is good than bad. Then, like Jim Gaffigan, you can think of yourself as a good fat. I think one of the best things you can do for yourself is to get a DEXA scan. I know I harp on it a lot, but it gives you so much valuable data. It can't tell you whether your subcutaneous fat is young fat or old fat, and it can't tell you how much brown fat or beige fat you have, but it can tell you how much total body fat you have and give you a really good estimate of how much visceral fat you have, which is extremely important to know. It'll also tell you how much total body muscle you have, which is hugely important to know, and you can make some inferences about intramuscular fat, but that gets a little tricky. All in all, if you've never had one, getting a DEXA scan will give you so much valuable information you can use to make your life better now and in the future. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen today. I hope it's been worth your time to think through your different types of body fat. Fat is not all bad. I think we intellectually know that we need some, but we often think of it as kind of a necessary evil. But it's not. It's essential and it's part of a healthy body. I think it would be good to think about ways to increase certain types of body fat, both because brown and beige fat are super healthy for you and as a mental exercise in accepting and loving your body, including your fat. Way more important than the amount of your body fat is the health of your fat. You can work to make your fat more healthy. If you have virtually no visceral fat and intramuscular fat, and you steer most of your subcutaneous fat to be young fat rather than old fat, then you'll have a healthy body with a lot of good years ahead of it, even if you have a little bit of padding that you can see. You can't tell someone's metabolic health and inflammation levels by looking at them. This is not about appearance or thigh gaps or crop tops or whatever. It's about your long-term metabolic health. Next week, we're going to talk about how sleep is not a pillar of health. Until then, love your good body fat and don't be normal. Thank you so much for tuning into the Health Courage Collective podcast. I am truly honored that you have paid me the enormous compliment of your time and attention. I would be so grateful if you would share this podcast with someone you know and subscribe so you never miss an episode. This podcast is for entertainment and information purposes only. Statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Christina Hackett and producers, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse events by use of information contained herein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.